Hello and welcome to the Media Podcast. Think of us as your very own media club. I'm Matt Deegan. On the show today, what can we expect for our industry from the next government? We look through the manifestos that were launched this week. Also on the programme, Paramount still seeks a suitor after a deal with Skydance goes south. What next for the owners of Channel 5? All that plus we speak with Matt Sayward, the co-founder of Platform Media, about their recent acquisition by PodX. Strictly's in another controversy, the inside story on the Evening Standard going weekly, and in the media quiz, we talk off the record. That's all to come in this edition of the Media Podcast. In the news this week, tributes have been paid across the media to Dr. Michael Mosley, who was found dead on the Greek island of Symi. He was 67. His work on TV for Channel 4, BBC Sounds and the Daily Mail meant that he was known to millions. And now Channel 5 faces a decision about their forthcoming series with Mosley, which was due to air soon. Channel 4 are investigating another tragic death, that of producer John Balson, who had taken his own life a few weeks after working on their true crime series In the Footsteps of Killers. And the Evening Standard's Tristan Kirk was also the winner of the Paul Foot Award on Tuesday, which celebrates investigative journalism in the UK. His reporting into the court scandal involving the single justice procedure, which became known as SJP, no doubt to the annoyance of Sarah Jessica Parker. Well, with me in the London podcast studios, at least via link up to discuss this week's top media stories, we welcome back Jake. No, not from Jamiroquai, but Jake Kanter from Deadline. Hello, Jake.
Hello. Not the globe-trotting pop star, no.
You haven't got a selection of travelators under your home office there that moves you around the room?
Sadly not. I wish so.
But you've been quite busy because I've seen a piece that you published today on Deadline about Clive Myrie. What's he been up to?
I mean, this is a sort of thorny issue that raises its head occasionally with the BBC. News presenters, other presenters at the BBC, like to moonlight and do some extracurricular work, usually speaking engagements. There's a well-trodden speaking circuit for these individuals, and they earn good money doing it. Clive Myrie can command fees of £10,000 and over for some of the engagements that he does. Usually they're pretty uncontroversial. In fact, they're sort of designed that way. All bookings are signed off by BBC managers. But what I wanted to do was just dig into it a little bit. And it's quite common for BBC presenters to go and speak for investment companies, asset managers. So I wanted to just take a bit of a step further and look at the investments that some of these companies are making and whether they are tied up in any controversial industries or industries that are linked to ongoing events. And in the case of Clive Myrie, he spoke a number of times for a company called Quilter, and Quilter has investments in some fairly significant defence manufacturers, a company called RTX, which used to be Raytheon, and BAE Systems, which I'm sure will be well known to a lot of listeners, both of whom have links to supplying arms to the Israeli military. And people I've spoken to have said that may raise potentially a perception of risk to impartiality. And there have been questions about Clive Myrie's judgment. He's not the only one. Naga Manchetti has taken on similar work in the past as well.
I can understand that, but it's quite a small investment that the company have in those firms. I mean, you had the numbers, I think, in your piece. It's sort of like 30 billion odd of investments, and this was sort of in the 50 millions. Like it's quite a small investment. Is it up to Clive Myrie to know every investment that this company is making, small or large?
Absolutely. We've been transparent about the figures. They are small investments. I think. So I tried to think about this if I was a BBC presenter. The expectations of BBC presenters are to be as impartial as possible. And I think that extends beyond just a sort of practical application of impartiality. I think it incorporates perception as well. And I think Tim Davie has been very, very clear about that. It is one of his key priorities, and I therefore think it has to filter down to people like Clive Myrie, who is now arguably the BBC's highest profile news presenter. And if I was Clive Myrie, I'd be thinking, well, we know that there can be controversies about the way asset managers invest in companies, particularly where there are controversial industries at play? And should I be checking on their investments before agreeing to take on a big fat fee and working to present or to moderate sessions for them?
All of these companies are interlinked. I look and your sister company, South by Southwest, they've just had the same issue. You have South by Southwest has sponsors that are RTX and BAE, and a load of people have decided not to go to that event because the sponsors are there. Don't these companies, aren't they just all parts of everyone's life? We can't force Clive to only do very, very specific things that have no controversy whatsoever. Shouldn't he be allowed to earn a few quid doing something?
Yeah, he's perfectly entitled to do that. And my story is not saying he shouldn't be doing it. Well, I'm certainly not saying that. I'm just pointing out these facts. And I think the genesis for this was, we've seen this huge controversy over Baillie Gifford and its sponsorship of literary festivals. Many of whom have now dropped Baillie Gifford because of its links to fossil fuel. That includes Hay Festival. So this is topical. I wanted to trace a line between some of these issues and ask whether they may present issues for the BBC, which allows its presenters to engage in this kind of extracurricular activity.
Well, whilst we're on the subject of famous people in the media, someone who is, of course, famous in their own right, the arts and media correspondent at the Iron newspaper, Adam Sherwin, joins me. Hello.
Good evening. You flatter me.
But you've been talking about someone quite powerful as well in an article that dropped today at The Standard.
Yes, we took a deep dive into the decision to axe the daily print edition of the Evening Standard, which was announced a couple of weeks ago. It's now going to come out once on a Friday. There's going to be a kind of beefed up digital side to it as well. But a lot of people were kind of very sad that a city the size of London couldn't sustain a free daily newspaper. So we were looking at Evgeny Lebedev, who owns the Standard, and talking to some senior figures around him, people who have worked for him, people who do work for him, to try and find out a little more about what's gone on there and why that decision was taken. And what we kind of found out was that this was a decision that Lord Lebedev, as we should properly describe him, had agonised with over years, even since COVID, when the Standard circulation began to fall.
Because in your piece, you talk about the fact that it's sort of no great surprise that the paper was losing money. He's invested a lot of cash into it. And also, he used to have a lot more cash than maybe he has now.
Yes, it's not actually clear how much money the Lebedev family still has. They've been under a lot of pressure, as all Russian emigre business people are, and he had to bring in outside investment. He brought in a Saudi investor who bought a 30% stake in the Standard. As we understand it, that outside figure was also quite influential in saying, we can't carry on like this with the Standard. It is losing millions of pounds every year. The print side is never going to improve, and you, Evgeny, need to make a decision about its future.
There's been lots of questions, hasn't there, about your Middle Eastern support of UK media operations, and everyone thinks it's because they want to have influence, whereas the Saudis here just want to make a buck or two, don't they, it seems?
Yes, this investor, there's even been an Ofcom investigation to discover whether he was or wasn't a member of the royal family.
Right.
And the Lebedevs are very clear that he's not, and that's what's come out. He has connections to the State Bank, but he's not actually a member of the royal family. But still, you'd think the prospect of somebody increasing their equity stake in a paper like that at the time when the government, as was about to put in new rules which would restrict sovereign wealth funds and overseas governments owning majority stakes in newspapers. It almost feels like Evgeny's a little bit stuck here now. He needs outside investment into the paper, but Saudi investment is an area now which is going to be very difficult for media owners to look to.
Yes, the combination of Russian and Saudi money isn't a brilliant one if you're trying to build a media business. Everyone's felt that the Standard was on somewhat live support for its daily edition. COVID, unhelpful. Wi-Fi on the tube, unhelpful, though maybe a little bit over-egged sometimes, I feel. Because the family have done quite a good job with The Independent, taking that from an analog business into a digital one. Do you think they can do the same trick again?
Well, Evgeny's people are kind of being optimistic about this and saying, that was a bold move for The Independent. I worked there when The Independent went online only and got rid of the print edition, and it has worked. It's very profitable now after being a hugely loss-making title for many years. So something could happen with the Standard. But what they are going to need is some serious investment in the journalism. This process they're going through now is going to lead to, we understand, about 2/3 of the editorial staff leaving. Now, you're not going to be able to cover a city like London. We've had London being the centre of this election campaign when it started with stories about Diane Abbott and Jeremy Corbyn, and there's issues like child poverty and areas where you'd really expect the Standard to carry on being at the centre of those stories. If they're just turning out web stories that are of global appeal and not particularly London based, and they can't go for a paywall model, I think, because they're not really set up for that digitally, how are they going to get the investment and the journalism?
Jake, do you think London should have a print title, or are we past that now?
I think look, first and foremost, it's really sad that this is happening. And, I think we should always lament job losses. It's never an easy thing. I having said all of that, I literally can't remember the last time I picked up a copy of the Evening Standard, even though it's presented to me at train stations.
Literally in your hand.
Yes, and that's because we've got this miraculous thing in our pockets called a mobile phone, and you can get all the information you need on there. And I think it's inevitable that the Evening Standard has suffered as a result of that.
And talking about the election, you mentioned the election there. Jake, did you watch the Sky News debate on Wednesday night?
I watched some of it, yes. It was really interesting, lively format. I think Sky News has done really well. I think Sky News is generally having a good election, actually. Its coverage has been vibrant and fun and slightly different to what we're seeing elsewhere. And last night was a great example of that, I think.
How did it do ratings-wise?
It's done not too bad. I can't remember the precise figure. Maybe I should go and dig that out.
I think it's about 800,000.
And it's difficult for a channel like that to cut through. I know on the same night, the interview with Rishi Sunak on ITV, that had very good ratings, I think.
Yeah, I must be the only politics junkie who watched the Rishi interview at 7 and then flicked over to Sky at 7:30 to just in time for the debate. Yes, the Rishi interview had been so well trailed, you felt you'd seen it a week in advance. And then at the same, you've got Nick Robinson was interviewing the SNP leader and the Welsh Plaid leader at the same time at 7 o'clock. It was a bit like that Blackadder episode where you have to go to two dinner parties at the same time and rush between the two.
If you just flick between the EPG, you get the best of all of it. We talked a lot on the show actually over the past few months about GB News, and that this might be the GB News election. Had a lot of right wing interest, had a lot of right wing stars. We haven't really seen that at all. I haven't really seen them in the mix.
It's kind of like the dog that didn't bark, isn't it? Or the barking dog that didn't bark. Because beforehand, Ofcom even had to talk to all the media and explain that their rules of GB News were going to be very tightly controlled during the election. They'd even given Nigel Farage the ability to actually be a candidate and still do his programme, which now would feel extraordinary if he was on every night at 8 o'clock, telling you to vote for reform. So, but in actual fact, the loss of Farage and Jacob Rees-Mogg and these kind of tent poles in the GB News schedule at night has meant that it has lost a lot of influence, because if you want to see Nigel Farage, well, he's on all the other channels as well, isn't he? A lot less now, perhaps, after the initial splash of his standing, because the broadcasters have to keep within the limits of where the polling of each party is, and Reform is still about 11%. But it feels like GB News, and it's not an outsiders broadcast election. It feels much more like the traditional broadcasters are, and even the print papers, because stories are being dropped under embargo for front pages. They are still having their influence.
Jake, do you think that it's partly a resources issue, and it's quite hard? You've got to really be on the trail. You've got to be out there. You've got to be talking to people. You need camera crews in places. They're just not resourced well enough to be in all the places they need to be.
Yeah, I mean, I thought Adam made some great points there about it actually being more of an insider's election than GB News would like. I mean, it's true. I mean, it's clear you hear Sky News, BBC News talking about the cost of actually providing thorough coverage of an election. You have to pay to get on the battle buses, for example, which is something that GB News may not be able to do with all the individual candidates. I thought, its audience is treading water at the moment, hasn't really benefited from the closure of Talk TV. As Adam was saying, it's two of its biggest presenters in Nigel Farage and Jacob Rees-Mogg have been off air for more than 3 weeks now. So I don't think that helps. The other really intriguing thing, I think, was that GB News polling suggested that its audience would break for Labour, which is not necessarily the tone of the output on GB News. So I think that's an interesting conundrum for them to keep an eye on in the future.
I mean, also it sort of shows the kind of power of the red wall and those people and what those people are interested in. Maybe it isn't such, what is right wing in today's world.
It tells you why quite a few Labour shadow cabinet members are going on GB News and they're giving interviews, because they do understand that there are swing voters in those red wall seats in the northwest where GB News is, a way to reach those voters. So, if we do head into this big majority Labour government, GB News is going to, on the one hand, wants to be part of the Tory leadership meltdown to come, and whether Farage has a role in that, but also it's going to want to try and stay on board a little bit with the government, and it has to for Ofcom rules. It can't just go completely having right-wing voices on it. It must have some political balance across the schedule. So
what do we know about manifestos in regard to media policy? Jake, what have you noticed?
Well, it's been incredibly bland. We've had no big promises, which is probably not a surprise, to be honest. I think it's been really interesting reading the Labour manifesto today. There's a bit of Jeremy Corbyn and Brexit about it, and the fact that they're sort of keeping some constructive ambiguity about their position on the BBC. I do think their lack of commitment on the licence fee is probably quite telling, and I think we're in a situation now where conversations about overhauling the BBC's funding are more palatable than they've ever been. I think there's sort of more acceptance in the industry than there's ever been, that change is probably in the air, and it'll be really fascinating to see how that plays out with the Labour government. In the short term, I mean, that won't be until 2027. In the short term, the BBC will have to grapple with funding deals as far as Labour is concerned. The most recent deal in December sort of kicked open the door to annual funding agreements based on inflation. And it'll be, telling as to how Labour, if they get into power, approach those conversations, whether they give the BBC a bit more wriggle room and a bit more money to play with.
I mean, Adam, the Conservatives sort of have rode back on saying that they're going to end the licence fee instead of looking to review it, which could have been an easy win for them, just saying, we're going to abolish it and do something else. We won't have to worry about actually enacting that policy. The Labour said they were supporting public broadcasters. Anything in there that surprised you?
Well, yeah, just the fact that they could have raised that, we will look and introduce alternative to the licence fee as a promise. That's pretty much what they had been saying in the Boris Johnson, Nadine Dorries era, but the language changed under Sunak and Lucy Fraser, who's Culture Secretary. She wants to look at all the options. But so that was a bit surprising that they didn't offer any kind of red meat to their own supporters. And in the Labour manifesto, I think what particularly interesting was the lack of any commitment to any press reform and no mention of Leveson 2, which was in the 2019 manifesto. So for those looking at which newspapers might endorse which parties, a lack of any commitment whatsoever to bring in any form of state-backed press regulation will probably weigh heavily with the proprietors of those newspapers.
Yes. Do you think the Sun will back Keir Starmer?
It's what we're gathering, and David Yellen said he's been the former editor of The Sun, has been told by sources that that's where we're heading.
It's going to be a lukewarm endorsement.
It's going to be so lukewarm you might not even notice it, because I think if you read the leader columns of The Sun so far during the campaign, they are singularly unimpressed with Labour. And we know that there is a certain coolness in relations amongst the top brass and Starmer personally, because he sanctioned prosecutions of journalists at The Sun when he was Director of Public Prosecutions.
Well, another battle that's happening in America this time is between Paramount and their potential acquirers. The Paramount merger with Skydance is off. Jake, this has been complicated. What's been happening with Paramount and Skydance?
It's a great big hot mess, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to articulate how clearly, because it's been a story of so many twists and turns over so many months. It's quite difficult to sort of capture in a neat soundbite. But it's, as I say, it's a messy process. It says a lot about the changing fortunes of Hollywood. Paramount remains an important and desirable brand, but it's saddled with these decaying TV channels, and is also ran in the streaming wars. It's been absolutely thumped by the likes of Netflix and Disney. And meanwhile, you have Shari Redstone, who is the proprietor, daughter of Sumner Redstone, and a sort of iconic media mogul who died in 2020, and she's been sort of somewhat resistant to selling off the family treasure, and she's nuked this deal with Skydance, after months of doing this dance with them, and in the process firing her chief executive, overseeing the departure of 4 board members, and bowing to some sweeteners with David Ellison, who runs Skydance, and it's not very clear where things are going to go from here. Whether Shari Redstone does a full sale of both National Amusements, which is the majority owner in Paramount, or whether she does a sort of piecemeal sale, breaks up the business, carves it up, and sells it that way. It's going to be fascinating, and of course it has ramifications here in the UK because Channel 5 is owned by Paramount, and Paramount Plus is available as a streaming service in the UK as well.
Adam, we're back to strong media types again, aren't we? You got Sherry at the top, family business, a lot of issues with that family. There's an amazing book called Unscripted. If you haven't read, definitely go and read to get the true background. She has the kind of controlling shares, the voting shares, but doesn't own the majority of the company. So she can kind of force a deal through, but she needs to be looked after as well as the Paramount shareholders. And if anybody gets a slightly better deal, opens up the world to a million lawsuits.
Yeah, the way that she pulled the plug from this deal and pulled the rug under everybody had a lot of Shiv from Succession energy. It was almost pretty much from the last series. So, and it sort of presages what could happen to the Murdoch empire when you've got family members who've got privilege level of stock and shareholders who want something different happening. So, yeah, I think this is going to be, the shape of things to come for media families that are crumbling gradually.
Yes, well, that story's not going to go away. Thanks both. We'll be back with more media news after this. And welcome back. Now, last month there was a big money deal in podcasting when PodX swooped in to invest in Platform Media, a podcast and social media startup that's only existed since 2020. Earlier, I sat down with Matt Sayward, co-founder and chief strategy officer of Platform, to find out how 1 month in the new partnership is going.
Ultimately, what they give is a lot of peace of mind in terms of the short-term realities of managing a business like this. Because, the kind of transactions we do are infrequent and large. And so when one of those is late, it can... Yeah,
it's a small business cash flow challenge.
It's that's a real thing. And you don't want to have to make poor long-term decisions to facilitate the short-term outcome of whether it's making payroll or whatever. But the other thing that they give us is the confidence to be able to take some really big swings in terms of entering more into the original space, because it's quite funny really, because we started with Good Bad Rugby as our point of origin, this big splashy original that we've turned into a multi-million-pound turnover business in its own right, but we haven't really done a lot more Good Bad Rugby since the original one.
It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and they don't always come off.
And investment. It takes investment as well. And, we, as a small emerging business, we basically chased every opportunity we saw over the first few years. And we saw inherent opportunities with commissioners. We were able to work with commissioners in different ways, because ultimately our business model was, and still is, that we saw discoverability and marketing and commercialization as the kind of two preeminent challenges in podcasting writ large. Certainly if you want to discover a podcast in and of itself, if it's not on the front page of Apple or Spotify or being recommended to you, it's word of mouth or broke effectively, and that's where social really comes into its own, particularly for us. And so having that as a bit of a skill set in our locker was really interesting to commissioners when we started to work with them, because we would not only do a kind of commission production deal, we'd also be engaging a different department of these commissioners and kind of bolting on a marketing campaign as well to try and ensure that the show was a success, and then hopefully that recommissions and this makes the show more famous. A bit of a virtuous circle.
Yes.
So there's aspects of our model that were then very interesting to people in other spaces, and the same is true of brands as well, because there's a lot of brands who want to invest in podcasts and tell us as much, but struggle to, because they don't know if they're, in terms of investing in original content, would struggle to justify making that investment because they can't be sure that they will get a return on their investment. Because
there aren't a huge amount of successful breakout branded shows, are there?
Not loads. There's not loads. We are fortunate to make at least one of them in Upfront with Simon Jordan that we made for William Hill. And
probably that one and Dish are probably the two that people talk about a lot.
Probably the preeminent one. It was quite a surreal moment yesterday when we were heading on the train to our company retreat, and we were on the train out of Waterloo, and we went out through Clapham Junction. And I just saw I've never seen quite as long a billboard as the one that had 3 Upfront, which is the new spin-off we've launched of that show, advertised on. It was quite a surreal moment seeing that. It's that show is doing absolute gangbusters.
Tell me about the journey of Platform Media. Where did it come from? What does it do? Where are you up to the point where you got this investment?
The business started in COVID. So I was introduced to a guy called Matthew Sherry. It would have been August 2020 when we were introduced to one another.
So literally just as kind of lockdown kicked in.
Yeah, just as as everything was going south. Yeah, we had this really strange conversation, Matt and I. He was working in a kind of a traditional sports publishing company. He was quite a young entrepreneur. He founded I think it's still the UK's only NFL publication. When he was 21, he did that within this sports publishing group, and he at the time was looking to pivot this magazine business towards podcasts, kind of seeing that's where the puck was heading and wanting to account for it. And so he had obviously started this NFL magazine and built it into a digital brand and all this kind of stuff without much other than his kind of enthusiasm for the sport in a market that hadn't really taken to it yet. It's predated, any meaningful broadcast deals and anything like that for NFL. So he built this embryonic thing into something of its own right, and he got the opportunity to pitch to James Haskell and Mike Tyndall and Alex Payne around the rugby podcast that they were kind of taking to market, tendering at the time. And the vision he sold to those guys was that if I could build this media brand in NFL with just me, a lad in Hartlepool, think about what I could do with a former World Cup winner and member of the royal family and the most followed rugby player, past or present, in the history of rugby. And they kind of loved that 360 approach to, let's not just start a podcast, let's build a brand. And he and I got introduced to one another while he was starting to pitch for that opportunity. And it emerged over the course of this crazy phone call that we'd both independently of one another had the exact same business plan, based on the weird same exact anecdotal observations of how things were moving in the US market and various other machinations. So within 2 minutes on the phone to one another, we were finishing each other's sentences, and now 4 years later, that kind of continues to still be the case.
And so what's the business today?
So the business today is, we started with that rugby podcast. It was quite a splashy launch when it happened. So the guys were on the One Show and Good Morning Britain and things like that promoting it. And Mike has quite an extensive little black book for many reasons. And he started fielding various inbound inquiries from people. Oh, this thing that you're doing looks quite interesting. What's all this about? And this was from comedians and entertainers and stuff who at the time their work was kind of drying up and they were looking for something to do during that COVID moment. And we kind of thought we could spin an entire production business out of the back of this brand building approach to podcast that we've taken that kind of spans audio, video and social.
So how many of you are there?
I think we're about 60 now.
Wow.
Most people look at us and think that's a production company, but we're kind of a production and a distribution and a monetization company at this point, because we've got this social amplification network that we use for distributing the content, and that's the backbone of a lot of our commercial campaigns. And we've also got our own sales team that are selling podcasts in a very different way than most kind of networks are selling podcasts, because of the multi-channel approach that we're taking. So we don't often talk to audio buyers when we sell a podcast campaign. We're often talking to partnerships teams in media agencies instead. So we're quite differentiated in that sense. So we kind of have a company that could go up against any number of businesses, whether it's production companies, whether it's social publishers, whether it's the likes of Acast and Audio Boom, when we're responding to briefs. But equally, we could also collaborate with any of them at a moment's notice as well. So we're in a really interesting agnostic position where we can basically work with anyone.
PodX as an organisation, they're sort of Nordic-based kind of media professionals that have got a load of cash, sort of from a family kind of fund, I think.
Yep.
And they've been investing into lots of different podcast companies around the world. So who contacted who? Who got in touch? What was that first meeting?
I think they got in touch with us, and when we first met them, it would have been around the podcast show last year.
Okay.
So yeah, we met them in our studios, I think the day before the podcast show in 2023, and thankfully we managed to get the deal done in time to announce it just before the podcast show 2024.
So it's got a year journey. It's not a short amount of time.
No, and it wasn't an intense negotiation period for all the way through that. There was a few months where we were quiet, and it's interesting really because a year does tend to be about how long these things take for better or worse. But when you get that first kernel of interest from an M&A perspective, you kind of feel obliged to explore the market and what else is someone's expressed interest now, so we better go and see what else is out there. And it just so happened that the first ones that approached us was the right partner for us. Could have saved ourselves a beauty parade there.
And that takes a lot of management time.
It takes a lot of management time, and that's probably the thing. That's probably the cautionary tale, I suppose, in a lot of this, is that you be prepared to have a second job effectively while you're doing that, because the stuff you have to do to drive your business forward is not going to stop, but also you're going to have to make the time to explore that.
So having been through this year-long process, if there are people out there listening who run their own businesses, what advice would you give to them about being in that right position to have an investment or to be acquired?
Make sure you've got the time to go through it properly, and to make sure you're ready for what it entails, because it's the due diligence process is time consuming, absorbing. It won't be fun for most businesses. I mean, and start-up bootstrap businesses will inevitably come from a beginning where they've been run something akin to a market stall.
Yes.
And then retrofit process and operational structure and all this kind of stuff around the back of it. And, the idea of going through a due diligence process can be quite daunting, and I'm sure enough to make people go, that's probably not for me at this point. So yeah, just make sure you're ready to go through that, and just, ask yourself what you're looking for from a partner. For us, it was really important that we work with a lot of people, and it was very important to us that we were able to continue to work with a lot of people. And, there would be some media businesses out there where if we were in their stable, it would mean we couldn't work with this person anymore. And we wanted to be able to retain that ability to collaborate with anyone. So PodX made sense for us from that perspective, and various others. But yeah, it kind of depends what you're looking for. What we want to do is keep building the business that we've already built and do it in an infrastructure that means it's more likely to succeed, and that's what we've got. We've got safe harbour for what's hopefully a great journey to come.
Well, great to hear from you. Good luck with it all.
Thank you very much.
And we'll have you on another year to tell us how it went.
Yeah, great.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks to Matt Sayward. Adam and Jake are here with me. And the impact of baby reindeer is still being felt in unforeseen ways. Jake, you've been writing about this in Deadline. What's been happening, and what are producers telling you?
So the big update in the baby reindeer story is that Fiona Harvey, who is the real-life Martha, has slapped Netflix with a giant lawsuit, claiming that they have defamed her, and they had no right to tell her story without permission, and it's raised all sorts of fascinating questions about duty of care and about compliance, and I think this is having an impact beyond Netflix. I reported last week that producers working on factual dramas for the BBC, of which there are many, including a Lockerbie series, and a series about a model who was kidnapped. And they're saying, we need to know more about these things. We want to make sure that we don't fall into the baby reindeer trap and make the same mistakes that have happened on that show that have created this entire circus around what has been essentially a really big hit.
Would they have been in a better state had they said this is based on a true story rather than this is a true story?
I do think that wording has created difficulties for Netflix. They've doubled down on it as well and talked about it being a true story in Parliament. And I think if they'd have come up with a more imaginative or playful phrasing, I don't think we'd be having this conversation right now.
Adam, isn't this a repeat of sort of the Crown controversy that we've sort of seen before? Is Netflix's compliance department not up to scratch?
Well, with the Crown, you kind of knew that the royal family would never complain, even if they had been defamed. So they were on much safer ground, probably emboldened Netflix to make more of these real life dramas. And clearly their defense is quite interesting. They say that they took care so that the person would not be identified. Well, clearly that's not going to stand up in court. But they're also strongly defending Richard Gadd, who wrote the series based on his experience, his freedom of speech, his right to tell his story, and maybe fighting this in the American courts where the legal action has been deposited means that they could use the First Amendment defences. I think it also probably means they're going to have to a lot more money will have to be shelled out if they lose this case, if it's going to be fought in the American courts.
And if she is like the Martha that is portrayed in Baby Reindeer, this person's not going to give up, are they?
Not when they've got very strong Hollywood legal team who have now taken up the case. And it's clearly going to be a great circus if this case goes to court. If Netflix can't find a way to settle out of court, they don't seem minded to settle out of court. I wonder how long it will be before the series itself has a new title underneath it of based on a true story, because you can't imagine it's going to carry on as this show continues to be seen with that contested phrase on it.
Another show that's having a bit of trouble in that department is the BBC and Strictly Come Dancing. The BBC have dropped audience favourite Giovanni after weeks of stories circulating of alleged bullying of celebrity partners. It's something that he denies. Jake, we're used to controversy around dancing partners. Sometimes the sort of the curse of Strictly and the romances are all part of the story. How are the BBC handling this one?
Yeah, well, this is sort of a curse in the opposite direction. Usually it's dance partners becoming intimately connected, whereas in this case, you've got a war that has broken out between Giovanni and his former partner on the last series, Amanda Abingdon, who has appeared in all sorts of shows as an actress. She's most notably Sherlock. It's clear that Amanda feels incredibly raw about her experience. She's called Giovanni nasty in an interview recently with the Mail on Sunday, and reporting suggests that she has filed a complaint through Carter Ruck, that notoriously shy and retiring law firm. So it'll be really interesting. I mean, I think clearly the BBC has made a decision that they don't want any of this to overshadow the next series, and that's probably why they've made a decision to not have Giovanni as a professional dancer on the next series. Whether he'll come back, whether the door remains open, will probably depend on the outcome of any investigation, and I'm sure that is ongoing at the moment.
I mean, Adam, he's popular, but it's a big show. A lot of things happen. Is he going to be missed?
I think so. I mean, people remember that Rosalie Ellis dance, and it was hugely popular. I think people probably forget a little bit that we just see this as a light entertainment celebrity show. But for the dancers, this is actually a very serious competition. They're competitive. They do ballroom dancing. They want to win this competition, and they want to get their celebrity partner up to the level of winning. And that's what makes the show kind of different. It's what gives the show a little bit more of an edge to the other shows that you have.
Well, the Conservatives want to look at the way the BBC handles complaints against staff. Do you think that's sort of electioneering, or have they got a point?
They say the BBC shouldn't be allowed to mark its own homework, and I think that's probably good for the BBC to have some sort of distance so that they're not people can have confidence that when a complaint is made against a BBC personality, that complaint is handled without it, someone influencing it from within the BBC. So that if that's the toughest thing that the BBC had to face from another Conservative government, they'd probably be quite happy with that.
I mean, Jake, the BBC have obviously had issues with complaints. We had that around Hugh Edwards as well. They're sort of the poster boy for it, but this is something that happens in all organisations, not even just in media organisations, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, we have seen a sort of wave of stories about concerns regarding professional conduct of on-screen stars in the last year or two. I mean, you just got to look over at Channel 4 to see other examples. You know, Dick and Angel Strawbridge were let go amid bullying complaints. Ant Middleton, the star of SAS, Who Dares Wins. Channel 4 also severed ties with him. So this is an issue, a perennial issue for broadcasters, for sure. Any
plans for you to join the Strictly lineup this year?
I'm not allowed to say anything at this point, Matt. You know that.
Jake, would you take to the dance floor?
I'm gonna do a labour and maintain some constructive ambiguity.
Oh, good.
I think Ed Davey might be a candidate by the way he's conducting his election.
Yes, and was on this.
That's what he's aiming for, I think.
Was on this morning this week, I think, having a makeover as well. I think he's going to do all right out of the election, whatever happens to him. No one's approached me yet. I'm still open for any reality shows, obviously for the good of the podcast. Okay, just enough time for the media quiz. This week we're playing Off the Record. Not everything is for public consumption, so this week I will test you both on what stories and programmes are being made available to the public or staying strictly off the record. So the answer will either be public or off the record. That's what I'm looking for. You'll buzz in with your names if you know the answer. So Jake, you will say...
Jake.
And Adam, you will say...
Adam.
Let's play Off the Record. Question number 1. Channel 4's new quiz show, James Acaster, People Person.
Jake.
Jake.
Off the record?
It is off the record. Why is it off the record?
Oh, it's something to do with the format of the show, which I cannot remember for the life of me.
So his new quiz show, People Person, it's off the record because it's a non-broadcast pilot. They're
right.
Just trying it out. Do we know what the format is?
No.
No. We'll never know. We'll have to wait to see if it goes to series. Right, question number 2. 10-year-old Martha Sheehan's plans for a radio station about space.
Adam, I'll say on the record, that sounds plausible.
Yes, this was one of the things that I do with Fun Kids. We have a spin-off radio station about space. Martha won the Guinness World Record for being the youngest ever program controller. She's 10, had a lovely time running the radio station and was particularly good at it. We launched it at a sleepover at the Leicester Space Centre this weekend just gone. Photos on the internet if you want to have a look. So yes, correct. That was public. And finally, question number 3. The Washington Post's Will Lewis asking for an NPR story on phone hacking to be dropped in return for an exclusive interview.
Adam,
yes.
I'll say he probably will contest that because he's got an army of PR people to answer all these questions. But there's certainly a strong suggestion that he did not want this story, which would look into his role in phone hacking.
He was very much looking for off the record, and unfortunately very public. Yeah. Jake, Washington Post, we touched on it last week on the show. It's looking not great for him. Do you think this might topple him?
I don't know too much about the internal politics of the Washington Post to be able to make a prediction about that. I mean, it certainly has quite a stink about it, this story. And as I'm sure Adam has pointed out, he is denying it furiously. The thing I kept thinking about when I read this is that Will Lewis was variously linked with very senior jobs at the BBC, both Director General and Head of News. And the BBC has been covering the phone hacking stuff in detail, and you just wonder what sort of cataclysmic happenings would have taken place at the BBC if he'd have been there and tried to suppress this story in any way.
I mean, Adam, Will has just bought a $7 million house in Washington. Do you think he's going to be spending more time in it over the next few months? Or will he ride out the storm?
It's certainly a battle of wills, and we'll see how strong Jeff Bezos is in backing the guy that he's brought in. He's been brought in to make some big changes there. He's slightly stepped back from the offence that he's caused and put out a statement saying he's got to learn to listen a bit more and all that sort of thing. So he's probably got another couple of months to try and turn this around. Is
this a good example of the difference between kind of UK news operations and US operations? Because what he was suggested doing, media bosses, media moguls aren't covered by other media organisations generally here. Was he thinking that he'd sort of get away with that over there?
There just seems to be quite a high amount of self-regard amongst great American papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. Things happen at organisations like Reach that they wouldn't believe, probably, how quickly a newspaper's staff can be, overhauled and changed. But they do like to think of themselves as being rather special, a bit like the BBC is here. So that kind of change, I don't think he quite thought about how that's going to play out on the staff floor. And
Jake's right, isn't he? Had he grabbed a top BBC job, this would have been another explosion at Broadcasting House.
Well, that's a great point, Jake, because we might have had like another sort of 45-day premiership in charge of the BBC. Yeah.
Well, I think that makes you the winner of the quiz. Adam, congratulations. And as a prize, you get to talk to Netflix about strengthening our own compliance regulations here at the Media Podcast. You can come back with that. That'd be great. Thank you both for joining me. How can people keep up with your work?
We are at inews.co.uk. I'm Adam Sherwin 10 on Twitter.
And Jake?
Deadline.com or Jake_Kanter on Twitter.
Thank you both. Well, that's it for today. Remember, there's 25% off your first booking at the London Podcast Studios, where we record our show every week. Just use the code MEDIAPOD. That's go to londonpodcaststudios.com, 25% off with the code MEDIAPOD. If you don't already, please follow the show on your favourite podcast app of choice. My name is Matt Deegan. The producer was Matt Hill, and it was a Rethink Audio production. We'll see you next week.